the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Miami Herald, Downbeat, and the Progressive. Mike created the blog Smartass Cripple in 2010, has published 2 books, Smartass Cripple's Little Red Book and Smartass Cripple's Little Yellow Book. Since 1992, Mike has directed the Access Project, a comprehensive initiative to make live theater accessible for people with disabilities at Remains Theater and Victory Gardens Theater here in Chicago. Mike's the founding member of the Chicago chapter of the Direct Action Disability Rights Organization, ADAPT. He's proud to have been arrested over a dozen times for civil disobedience. Mike is also founder of Jerry's Orphans, which organized annual protests against the Jerry Lewis telephone. Please welcome Mike Ervin. And then,
Alrighty.
all right?
Move over a little bit though. It's on top of my notes there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We good?
Hey everybody, am I heard all over the place here? Alright. I would say if you can't hear me, raise your hand, but if you can't hear me, how would you know to raise your hand? So hopefully you can hear me. Anyway, hi. My name is Mike, and it said I would be the person doing the lecture today. Certainly hope that that's not what I'm doing. I hope that it's not a lecture. I think what I'm going to do instead is tell you about my very fortunately timed life and how it coincided with a great political movement, and in my case, in many cases, just in the nick of time, and how that movement saved me and helped me get to this moment where I'm sitting here right now. We're going to start in the year 1962. What happened in 1962? A man named Ed Roberts, who had polio, tried to get into the University of California at Berkeley. Now, Ed Roberts spent about half his day in an iron lung. Has everybody seen pictures of iron lungs? They sort of look like space capsules. They're really strange looking. But he spent half his day in an iron lung. He said, I want to go to the University of California at Berkeley. And in his words, he was told, as he puts it, he was told, we tried cripples and that didn't work. And so he was not admitted. But he persisted. He said, I want to go to the University of Berkeley, California at Berkeley. I am academically qualified and I want to go. So he was enough of a pest to where they made a deal. They said, all right, you can attend Berkeley as long as you live in the student infirmary. And he thought, well, I don't really need to be in an infirmary, but okay, I'll live in the student infirmary. And Ed Roberts started attending as a freshman in 1962, the University of California at Berkeley. Now, where was I in 1962? Well, I was born in 1956. So I was living on the south side of Chicago, Langley Airport, with my mother and my older sister who had the same disability as me. I attended a school called Christopher School, and it was completely segregated. It is on 50th and Artesian. It is still there. It still has crazy little ramps going up the side of it. And it was strictly for kids with disabilities. Well, how do they determine a kid with a disability? I think how they determine it is if you were a freak or not. Because, you would think, well, what's somebody with a disability? Somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who's blind. But there was a kid who attended this school whose face had been burned in a fire, and his face was scarred, and that was it. No other disability. There was another girl who, and I kid you not, had a false nose, and it was made of clay and it was glued on, and every once in a while it would fall off. And she was sent to the school because she had a false nose. There was another kid who had no legs. He wore prosthetic legs. And the only way you knew he wore prosthetic legs is if he ran, because it made a lot of noise when you ran. But they were sent any kind of something that made you a freak, or made you different was considered a disability, and off you went to the segregated school. What was the infrastructure like in those days? Well, here's an image that I have that kind of gets it across. My mother took my sister and I around that time to the museum of one of them. I think it was natural history, one of the museums. And how did we get in? Because you've seen the front of the Field Museum. It's got like 1,000 steps on the front. Well, you know, there's elevators and such now. But at the time, I remember my mother pulling up to a way where trucks went in. And there was a steep ramp and a garage door lifted up. So my mother got my sister and I out of our station wagon. We went down this truck ramp, a garage door opened, and then we went on to a big freight elevator, about half the size of this room, and up into the Field Museum. And I don't know whether this is really true or not, but in my childhood memory, I remember there being a carcass of a stegosaurus on that freight elevator. Maybe just imagining that, but in my childhood memory, I remember riding up to go into the museum with the stegosaurus. That's what the infrastructure was like in 1962. In 1968, there was a law passed called the Architectural Barriers Act. And that said that all public buildings, city halls, things like that, have to be accessible. That was the first major law. So things started becoming a little more accessible right around then. 1969, what happened that year? Well, Ed Roberts is in full swing at the University of California in Berkeley. And not only is he living in Cowell, but so are about a dozen other disabled folks who heard that Ed Roberts had gotten into Berkeley and said, hey, I want to go too. And pretty soon a whole wing of Cowell is full of disabled folks. In 1969, where was I? I was attending an even more segregated school, which is about 4 blocks from here on the corner of Damon and Roosevelt. At the time, it was called the Illinois Children's Hospital School. That was the name of the school. And it was a boarding school, and it was for kids with disabilities from around the state. It was a school full of low expectations, as you can guess from the name. A degree from a place called the Illinois Children's Hospital School. I'm amazed that I got into college. I really am, that any college accepted a, oh look, this guy is from the Illinois Children's Hospital School, let's take him. But actually I was one of the more lucky people because some of the kids were from way downstate and had nobody come visit them or anything, any family or anything. At least I lived in the city and my mother took us home every weekend and things like that. But it was a very segregated school. The curriculum was very limited. 1974. What's going on in 1974? Well, in Berkeley, the people that had lived in Cowell were now living on campus of Berkeley. Because once they started filling up Cowell, they said, hey, we don't need to live in an infirmary anymore. Let's all live on campus. So Berkeley is becoming like a mecca for folks with disabilities. In 1973, they all formed what was called the first Center for Independent Living. Does everybody know what those are? Anybody? Centers for Independent Living are run by and for disabled folks. They must have a board of directors that's at least the majority disabled folks, and they provide services and advocacy. The very first one, 1973 in Berkeley, California, formed by Ed Roberts and a lot of the people who had migrated to Berkeley because it was one of the few places where you could get around. 1973, what also happened, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed. And that said that any recipient of public funds from the federal government must not, as they put it in the law, discriminate against the handicapped. Change the language since then. So that was 1973. Well, very, very fortunate for me because in 1974, I graduated from the Illinois Children's Hospital School and went to Southern Illinois University. Again, I'm amazed I got in, but I did. And because of the Rehab Act and because of Ed Roberts and because it went on in Berkeley, I did not have to go through the same stuff that Ed Roberts went through when it came time for me to go to college 12 years later. Had SIU said, sorry, we tried cripples and it didn't work, like Ed Roberts, I wouldn't have had to just stick it out on my own. I could have, because of the Rehab Act, I could have challenged them legally, and I got a lot more standing. So thanks to the work of Ed Roberts and the folks in California, the very year before I was able to go to college, the laws were passed and things were much better, to the point where I didn't have to go through what Ed went through to go to college. 4 years later, the year 1978, I'm getting ready to graduate college. What is life like then? Well, this is what I would call, in terms of infrastructure, the Medicar era. And I'm going to start talking a little more about transportation at this point, because this is what we're getting into now. I lived on the southwest side. I got a job at a newspaper writing obituaries. That was my job at a newspaper called the Daily Southtown on the south side of Chicago. How would I get there? Well, it was not too far away from where I lived, so in nice weather, I could walk, just drive my chair. But when it's not nice weather, which it usually isn't in Chicago, how would I get there? Well, again, I was lucky. I had an accessible van, and my mother would drive me there. Otherwise, I would have been out of luck, because there was no accessible public transportation. And if you wanted to get anywhere, you had to basically call a Medicar. And a Medicar is essentially an ambulance, which comes to your house and takes you somewhere and charges about $150 per round trip. There was, at the time, run by the city, a very limited transportation service. And it would run from like 10 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, and it would take you to doctor's appointments, and that was it. So what I would do a lot of times is say, I have a doctor's appointment downtown, and then they get a ride downtown, and they drop me off somewhere like Northwestern, and then I go do something else. And then I'd have them pick me up about 3 o'clock. Well, it was a nice doctor's appointment, and I go back home. But that was how you had to get around in the Medicar era. To go, now, of course, other people that worked at the Southtown could take a bus, had any number of options. But for me, my mother would drive me there, drive downtown, go to work, come back, pick me up, take me home. That's how I got to the Southtown. Okay, 1979, the next year. The Gang of 19 in Denver, Colorado. What this was 19 folks, all of them in wheelchairs. One day went out to a corner in downtown Denver. And this day, if you're ever in Denver, you go to this corner, I can't remember what street, it's Colfax and some other street. There'll be a plaque there commemorating the Gang of 19. That was 19 people in wheelchairs who, when the light changed, went out in the street, surrounded a bus that did not have a lift on it, and said, we're not leaving because this bus is inaccessible. They wanted the head of the transit board to come down and talk to them and work with them about ordering buses that had lifts on them so they could ride them. The Gang of 19 spent the whole night in that street holding that bus. After a while, the driver just took the keys and left, and they emptied the bus, and they held that bus all night. That started a movement called, and we'll be getting into that in a minute. By 1980, I wasn't working at the newspaper anymore. I was freelancing, still living at my mother's house in the southwest side. But then we entered what was called the paratransit era, emerging from the the Medicar era into the paratransit era. And how that would work is I remember receiving a brochure one day at home, and it said, guess what? The Chicago Transit Authority is now offering door-to-door service for people with disabilities. Well, first of all, the only reason they were doing this is because federal law had changed, and it said that transit entities have to do a little tiny little bit to help disabled folks get around. You can't totally shut down your transportation system. So that's all the CTA did. They did a little tiny little bit to help us. And it was buses run by CTA. There were 20 of them, and they were put on the streets. And they said, hey, sign up for this service and call us at this number and tell us you want to ride, and we'll come get you and we'll take you somewhere. Like, wow, this is really great. We can get around now. And I don't have to go with my mom all the time, and I don't have to depend on other people. I can get around. So, but we figured out in about 3 weeks that there were 20 buses and about 5,000 or 6,000 people trying to use them all at once. So what would happen is you would have to call at 5 a.m. the morning before and battle your way through a busy signal, and then maybe get a ride and maybe not. And the hours were limited, 9 to 5 on weekends, something like 7 in the morning till 8 at night on weekdays. It was hardly the same as everybody else. It was a little better than the Medicars. It cost a lot less. You didn't always have to go to the doctor, but nevertheless, if it was a Saturday night and you set out to go somewhere and someone who wasn't in a wheelchair set out to go somewhere, you would not be able to get there together. It was far from equal. And I remember it actually for a while, it felt good for a while, but after a while it turned kind of into an insult, because you might get turned down for a ride. And that feels rather insulting. How dare you turn me down for a ride? Or if it's 7 o'clock on a Saturday night, but you're past your curfew. After a while that turns from something exciting to an insult. But I remember a friend of mine saying that when she first got word about paratransit, she thought, oh good, because I go once a week to see my psychiatrist, and now I won't have to have anybody take me there. I can go there on my own. And then after about 3 weeks, she stopped taking paratransit to go to the psychiatrist, because she said that she would spend the first half hour of her time at the psychiatrist bitching about paratransit. All right, so in 1983, in Denver, where the Gang of 19 had been, we hear about the start of a group called Adapt. They now have accessible buses in Denver. In Chicago, we have absolutely zero, not one accessible bus in the whole city of Chicago. And Denver is starting to become like the Mecca now. Wow, you can get around there. There's accessible transit. Some people from Chicago went to Denver for the first meeting of ADAPT. I did not go, but some other people did. At the time, I was reading a book called Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, and it explains it's about community organizing. Probably all heard of it or maybe read it, and it just explains how power works very well. And this book was very intriguing to me. I'd never really thought about my situation in terms of a political situation and in terms of how to yield power. And all this is going on with me at once, and then these folks come back from Denver and they're like, wow, they got accessible buses, they get around, we should do that too. And I remember how I thought about when I first realized the whole idea of accessible buses. The street I lived on, Austin Avenue, was the main street, and a bus went by there every day. And it wasn't until these folks came back from Denver and told me about this that I thought, wow, you know what? I never once thought about I should be able to ride that bus. This public facility that's as much of a public facility as City Hall has been going past my house every day for 25 years, and it never once occurred to me that I had a right to be on there. And I felt kind of stupid, actually. But then I thought, oh well, it's time to change that. So, we formed the Chicago chapter of ADAPT in 1984. And what made ADAPT different, obviously, if you can tell from the Gang of 19, is their actions were non-violently aggressive. They would block streets, disrupt meetings, get arrested. They basically didn't take no for an answer. And that's what I liked about them, because they didn't take no for an answer. So some of the actions that we did, our first action was to completely disrupt the meeting of the Chicago Transit Authority. We brought noisemakers, we brought bullhorns, and we told them, from this day forward, you will order no more inaccessible buses. Every bus you order from now on will be accessible. And they're like, well, that's ridiculous. They said things like, if we do that, it's gonna take a half hour to load a wheelchair on the bus. Well, 15 minutes, I'm exaggerating. 15 minutes long, a wheelchair on the bus. It's so expensive that fares are gonna skyrocket. They put out all this propaganda to sort of scare people away. This was 1984. There was also a simultaneous lawsuit filed under the Illinois Human Rights Act. And that then the Illinois Human Rights Act that had just been passed, again, fortunately good timing for me, right around the time I wanted to start getting around, said you can't exclude people from public facilities based on disability. So the lawsuit challenged whether public transit was a public facility. So we're doing all these actions, getting a lot of attention in the newspaper because of our loud, aggressive actions, and this lawsuit is going on at the same time. I also moved out of my mother's house into public housing that was subsidized and folks with disabilities could live there and get rent subsidized. So once again, because of a program that other activists had created, I was able to move out of my mother's house and into the first apartment that I had on my own. We move up to the year 1988. On Martin Luther King Day of that year, which by the way we all know is a state holiday, but the judge who was the state judge opened her office to issue an opinion saying that she too believed that inaccessible buses was a violation and that they were public facilities. Essentially, we had won the lawsuit. This is while all these actions, 4 years of actions, 4 years of litigating this, and in Chicago, we had finally won a decision saying that we had a right to public transit. ADAPT nationally was chasing around the American Public Transit Association, which is the association that advocates for public transit systems. And they would not come out in favor of accessible transit. So what ADAPT nationally did, a lot of us from Chicago would join others in other cities, wherever it was that APTA had a convention, be it Montreal, be it Phoenix, be it St. Louis, and we would just go there and try to make their convention as miserable as possible by blocking streets, by storming the hotel, whatever we could do to make their lives hard, we would do. And we would get the attention of the press in that town, and the issue of public transit being inaccessible would rise up to the forefront whenever APTA came to town. 1990, a big year. The ADA had been underway. The Americans with Disabilities Act had been introduced and was actually gaining some momentum. In the spring of 1990, all of us from various ADAPT chapters went to Chicago, to Washington, D.C. And this was the spring. Word was that ADA was in trouble. So we had an action, and we all went to the rotunda of the Capitol, and we demanded to see the Speaker of the House and the head of the Senate. And much to my amazement, the Speaker of the House and the head of the Senate actually came to the rotunda. And they talked to us. And we told them that you gotta pass the ADA, and it has to say that every bus purchased from now on has to be accessible, and that all public transit has to be accessible if it's new. And they said, we'll get back to you, and they left. So 100 people proceeded to get arrested by making noise, changing their chairs together, etc. The next day we had what was called the Capitol Crawl, which was something you've probably seen pictures of. If you've ever seen pictures of folks crawling out the steps of the Capitol and abandoning their chairs, that was that day in 1990. Now we could have gone into the Capitol like everybody else through the front door, but of course it makes for much better pictures if we're crawling up the stairs. So that was the action for that day. And both of those actions got a lot of attention. And on July 26, 1990, the ADA was passed. And it said that all public transit had to be accessible. And sat on the south lawn of the White House and watched it get signed. Great day. Nice sunny day, and a great day in general. But of course, that was just one fight. And now, if you see public transit in Chicago, you see that it's all accessible except for the really, really old stuff that hasn't been remodeled substantially yet. But all the buses are new. Actually, every once in a while, I have what I call the green bus nightmare. It's a recurring dream I have. I had one just a week ago, actually. And it's where I dream that I'm on the streets, and the days of the CTA being inaccessible, the buses were painted green. And I'm sitting on the street, and all of a sudden a green bus goes by. And I say to myself, damn it, I thought those were gone 25 years ago. I can't believe there's still those damn green buses on the street. And then I wake up and I go, oh God, thank God, it was just a nightmare. But I guess I must be fearing regression or something. Anyway, ADAPT, by the way, stood at the time for American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit. That's where the acronym came from. But, so we won this part of it anyway with the ADA. But ADAPT then changed its emphasis to what it currently is today. And that is that to fight what we call the institutional bias. And what does that mean? Well, let me back up a little bit and tell you why I am here, how I got here today. I live in the South Loop, and I need assistance every day. Someone has to come in the morning and get me up, help me get in my wheelchair, get my food together, help me brush my hair. Everything you do every day, I do it too. I just have someone help me. Who does that? Well, I have a crew of people that take various shifts throughout the week and do that for me. And they are paid by the state of Illinois. They are hired by me. So if I wanted to hire one of you, I could say, okay, come on and work for me. And then I would sign you up, and you would work according to my instruction, but you would be paid by the state through money that comes from the Medicaid program. It's what's called a Medicaid waiver, and that means that states can say, we're going to spend money on something that's not, that helps improve access to Medicaid rather than restrict it. The institutional bias is, and Medicaid says that if someone is in the situation like I am now, like I am, where I need that kind of assistance, they have to go to a nursing home. That's what Medicaid says. So, if I present myself to the state and they want to spend Medicaid money, it says without a waiver, I would have to go to a nursing home. What Medicaid should say is the other way around, that we should first try to support people to the extent that we possibly can, and I believe we can support anybody in their home if we really, really want to do it, because I've seen people get 24 hours and do just fine. So I don't personally believe you can't support anybody in their home. But Medicaid should say the opposite. It should say, if you want to stay in your home, in your community, we should support you in doing that. But it doesn't. So it's up to each state And you get a big patchwork of situations where in some states you can get the kind of program that I benefit from, and in some states there's barely anything. And someone like me would have little choice but to go to a nursing home. So that was our emphasis switched to making it so that no one has to go to a nursing home in any state or has to move out of their community and the home of their choice against their will. The program, once again, my very fortunate timing in my life. As I mentioned, I moved out of my mother's house in 1984. The Medicaid waiver that created the program I benefit from started in 1983, the year before I needed it, just barely in the nick of time. And again, it was because of activists demanding it, not just it falling from the sky. Some of the things, so locally, the program that I told you about that I benefit from is called the Home Services Program. Locally, what ADAPT does a lot is to try to preserve and defend the Home Services Program. And we've done it in various ways, but the state government is usually the target. The governor and the legislature are the ones who decide how big that program is and how much money will be spent on it. We've done things like, we love to take over the Thompson Center, the big building downtown that unfortunately the policeman was shot at last week. But that's the state office building, and when the governor is in town, that's where his office is. 3 times already we've managed to get up enough folks to shut that building down by blocking doors, blocking elevators, blocking escalators, and things like that. So we spend a lot of time doing the kind of ADAPT actions that make ADAPT. Nationally, done the same thing. We still meet twice a year, usually in Washington or in some other city that's picked for some strategic reason. And we fight to make sure that we fight against the Medicaid bias. Some of the things, for example, that we've been able to do nationally is one year the first time that we shut up after George W. Bush was elected, and we had a big protest outside the White House, and he sent out a liaison to talk to people, and we thought, yeah, okay, we've seen liaisons before, but we talked to him anyway. Didn't hold out much hope for Bush, and one of our members presented to him a concept called money follows the person, which means that instead of the person having to go where the money is, i.e. you go to the nursing home, the money goes where you are, i.e. the money follows you into the community. Well, about 5 years later, the federal government passed almost $2 billion worth of money called Money Follows the Person by the same name. And as a reporter from NPR once traced the story, the liaison that came out to meet ADAPT that day said that's where it came from. So that's the kind of successes that we've had nationally. And then the amount of money that is spent institutionalizing people as compared to the amount of money that's spent keeping people in their homes has shifted drastically over the last 25 years. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact statistic, but it used to be that about 80% of Medicaid money was spent institutionalizing people. Now it's about 40%. So it's been like a big shift, and even though we still have way too many people going to nursing homes and we still have the institutional bias, there has been a big cultural shift away from the default to being to institutionalizing. But today, we face, since the last inauguration, era